Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Conference of Consulting Actuaries Leadership Development Podcast. My name is Michael Clark. I'm host of the podcast, joined today by my guest, Justin Hornburg. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, great, Michael. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to this. You and I have known each other for a number of years, served on the CCA board together for a time, which is how we got to know each other.
Right.
And I think, based on what I know about you, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation and with a lot to offer for our listeners.
Great. Well, thank you again. Thanks very much. I'm honored to be here.
No, this is awesome. So, for those that don't know you, I want to give a little bit of your bio just so that people can understand a little bit about what you do and why we're talking today. So, you are the owner and president at Justin Hornburg Consulting, your own firm. Obviously, I think as the name implies,
That's right.
based in Detroit. You've also worked at American Benefits Consulting and at MetLife with a focus on group insurance and employee benefits. So
Right.
we'll definitely want to get into a little bit more about that. Just I think there's some interesting things to unpack there because especially when you look at and maybe the Conference of Consulting Actuaries typical membership, you don't necessarily fit the mold, which is great. Um, and actually that gets into some of the other interesting things that I wanted to share with people about you. I mentioned you're a former CCA board member, which is where we met. You're the 2023 recipient of the CCA's Most Valuable Volunteer Award. Not a surprise there. I mean, from what I've seen from what you do with the organization, that was definitely warranted and well deserved.
Thank you.
Originally from the West Coast, but largely grew up in the New York area.
Correct.
And joined the CCA in 2007 after leaving MetLife, where you were, your typical insurance actuary, and said, all right, well, you're leaving there. You're now working for a consulting firm, so you should probably join the organization that has consulting in the name.
Exactly right. Even though I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but I'm very glad I did.
That's good. That's
Yes.
good. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. I don't think we had planned to necessarily cover that in a lot of detail today, but so you didn't know much about the CCA, but you figured, hey, I'm a consultant. Maybe I should join an actuarial association or organization that's focused on consulting. What did you get out of joining the CCA?
Well, when I was at MetLife, I had gone to a number of Society of Actuaries meetings, and I thought they were pretty good. But as I said, when I said, okay, well, I'm a consultant, I should join the Conference of Consulting Actuaries right now. And as I said, I didn't really know what the membership was like. I didn't really completely understand the sort of bimodal nature of retirement actuaries and healthcare actuaries. I didn't really sort of understand all that. But I think the first thing that I noticed was that I felt extremely welcome in the organization right away. And one of the first things I went to was the smaller firms community meeting. I think maybe the community had sort of just started, or it wasn't even a community back then. I think it was just a forum, or it was called something else. And I met a few other people there, and including one other person who was very much like me, had just left an insurance job, and she was going into consulting, and it was great. I just felt very comfortable, and I've been coming to the meeting, the annual meeting, ever since then. I only missed the one when I had a COVID scare. And then probably the thing that I've gotten the most out of it, and I've mentioned this, when, as you mentioned, I received that award, Most Valuable Volunteer Award, is I've gotten so much out of volunteering and the interactions with the people that I volunteered with on committees and in communities. That's been the most enriching part to me of being part of the CCA.
Oh yeah, and I can definitely echo that. I mean, the connections that you make can be extremely valuable and beneficial. And I would imagine I've seen this in other groups that I participate in. Someone like you who has a little bit more of a unique background and skill set, even in terms of what you do on an ongoing basis. Sometimes I find that to be maybe more valuable because when somebody has a question that comes up that deals with your area of specialty, like they know you. And so you're
Right.
the guy that gets the call.
That's exactly right. And I have been fortunate enough to pick up a couple of clients that way. So yes, it's been very good in that respect.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Well, let's back up a few years
Okay.
and talk about what led you to be an actuary in the first place.
Well, like a lot of other actuaries, I majored in math in college, but I went into it having zero idea of what I was going to do when I graduated. And one day, I've told this story before. One day, I happened to have a class, a math class, in the same building as the business school. I went to NYU in the same school as the business school at NYU. And unbeknownst to me, the business school actually had an actuarial studies program, but I didn't know about it. And I don't even remember if I knew anything about the profession. I might have heard about it, but I really didn't know. And they had like a career table out, and I was going looking at the career table, and it came to the actuarial studies area. And I don't know if you remember, but the society used to put out these little books with practice questions in them and stuff. And I looked at that, and I was like, okay, so I could potentially get a job where my job is passing exams, which is all I've done for the last 4 years is try to pass math exams. And I was like, well, somebody will pay me to do this. That sounds great. So I kind of decided at that point to take the first two exams. And fortunately, the business school did offer prep courses for the first two exams back in the day, course 100 and 110. And I took those exams, and while I was waiting for the results, I did get hired by MetLife, which was great. And so really that's it. I just kind of fell into it. I mean, like I said, I majored in math. I knew I liked math. And when I saw like, okay, could get a job doing this, I went into it, and I'm very glad that I did. It's been great.
No, that's awesome. I love. I think you probably have articulated it better than some that I've heard that kind of fell into it the same way. But they come across it and they're like, "Wow, someone's going to pay me to take and pass math exams. I'm in."
Ex This is great. Yeah, I'm in. Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly.
All right, so you get a job working for MetLife out of school. Then, for those that might not be familiar with the actuarial work that you do, give us a high level overview. Like what have you done when you were at MetLife and then American Benefits Consulting, and we'll talk a little bit too about your own firm that you've started not once but twice now.
Right. Exactly.
And well, I want to get into some of that, but talk a little bit about the actuarial work you do for those that might not be familiar.
Okay, well, the MetLife Actuarial Development Program, it was at the time anyway a rotational program, and
Hmm.
you do multiple rotations while you're still taking exams. Now, my second rotation was I rotated onto the actuarial department for the General Motors account. And at the time, the GM account was the largest non-government account that MetLife had. MetLife also has the FEGLI program, Federal Employees Group Life Program, which is the biggest account that it had at the time, and I think probably still is. But other than FEGLI, GM was the biggest account, which is, by the way, why I'm in Detroit now. I joined that unit, and then they moved it out here, and I came out with it. I went back and came back again, but that's how I got to Detroit in the first place, because I was working on GM. And at the time, MetLife was still in the healthcare business. MetLife went out of the healthcare business in the mid 90s. MetLife created Metra Health with the Travelers, which then ultimately got bought by United Healthcare, which is part of how UHC got so enormous. And so at the time when I was working on GM, I really started working on healthcare. But then when GM went out, when MetLife went out of the healthcare business, if you were in the group department at MetLife, what you worked on was life, disability, and dental. Those are our three big product lines in group life, in group insurance. And so that became the focus of my career, especially when I came back to Detroit to work on GM after I finished my exams. And so what I've spent most of my career on is really those three products. I would say life, dental, disability, but then also I branched out into leaves of absence, voluntary benefits, captive insurance programs, all things that are really kind of called ancillary benefits, meaning because they're ancillary to group health. Most employees, if you work for a large firm, you get healthcare benefits, and that's what a lot of people think of when they think of group
Hmm.
benefits is healthcare
Yeah.
and prescription drugs. But when you do your open enrollment, there's lots of other things you get the opportunity to you can buy. Your company usually gives you basic group life insurance. You can enroll for additional insurance if you want. You maybe can either enroll for voluntary long-term disability or buy up from, say, a 50% plan to a 60% of benefit plan and various other benefits. So these are things that a lot of times referred to as ancillary.
Hmm.
And they're almost all insured, with the exception of Short-term disability, a lot of the times, is self-funded by an employer. It might be just a salary continuation plan. A lot of times, dental is self-funded, just like healthcare is a lot of times self-funded, especially if it's a large group. But a lot of these benefits, life insurance is almost always insured for tax reasons. Long-term disability frequently and more commonly is insured now. And so when I worked on those benefits for GM, it naturally kind of translated to working on them for other companies as well. And when I went to ABC, which is a brokerage firm, that's what they were brokering, was large group life and disability programs. It was actually a sweet spot for me. And the reason for that was a lot of ABC's employees at the time were ex-MetLifers. So it was kind of like an ex-MetLife shop, and I kind of naturally fit right in there. Now, admittedly, a lot of the work that I've done and do now with respect to ancillary benefits is not really heavy duty actuarial work. It's not the intersection of mortality and morbidity rates and interest like you might think of when you're
Hmm.
doing a pension valuation or life insurance or individual life insurance work. A lot of times you don't really need an actuary to do that. A lot of that work is done by what's called underwriters. But my feeling is that the experience that actuaries get by going through the whole exam process, and fortunately for me, the training I got at MetLife really, I think, helped me add a lot more value than a traditional underwriter would in that space. So that's kind of my description of sort of what I do and what I've done over my career in ancillary benefits.
So having that actuarial background then gives you a little bit more technical expertise to make the consulting work that you do much more valuable.
I think that's exactly right. And I think where it also helped was, especially when I was at ABC as a broker, a big part of what we did was put out business for RFPs,
Hmm.
get bids in for large group life or disability programs. And then once that we became the broker on the case, we would also manage renewals. And a lot of that came down to negotiating with insurance companies on behalf of our clients. Well, it helped, I think, a lot. It added a lot of weight when the broker has an actuary who's doing those, helping with those negotiations. You kind of know where the bodies are buried in the insurance company. And so it helps you not let the wool get pulled over your eyes a little bit better
Hmm.
than
Hmm.
someone who doesn't have that background.
No, that's great. Well, so let's talk about then you're at MetLife. You explained kind of how that group evolved and eventually got I don't want to say dismantled, but it stopped being under MetLife. So
Yeah,
at that point in time, you start your own firm. This was originally back in 2007, if I have the timeline right.
correct.
That led you then to joining American Benefits Consulting. But then several years later, you say, oh, I'm going to leave ABC and I'm going to start up my own firm again. Like, talk to us a little bit about those two transitions, right? And starting your own firm.
Okay. Well, in 2007, I think what had happened was I felt, and this also happened in 2021 when I left ABC, is I think in both cases I kind of started to chafe a little bit against what I'll call sort of the corporate strictures. And I wanted to do things the way I wanted to do them. And and in some respects, that's a common thread that cuts across both times when I decided to go out on my own. The first time, I would say it was perhaps a little bit more impulsive, in that I was so focused on what I wanted to do, I didn't really, maybe I could have planned it out a little bit better. I didn't know who my potential clients were going to be. I just thought, well, I know enough to go out on my own now. And one of the firms that became my client almost right away was ABC, the one that eventually I became an employee of. And I mentioned earlier that ABC was an ex MetLife shop. It was a natural for me to join ABC because of what I did and what they were doing. But I
Hmm.
didn't want to be an employee because I had just left MetLife. I really wanted to do this on my own.
Yeah.
So the guy who was heading up ABC said, well, why don't we make you a 1099 contractor rather than a W-2? And I said, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. And I did that for about 3 years. ABC was my client for about 3 years. And then I did have some other clients, but ABC was my main one. And then I ran into a conflict of interest where one of my smaller clients, I was helping them in a dispute that they were having with a client of theirs. Well, that client of theirs became a prospect of ABC,
Mm.
and I couldn't do both.
Yeah.
And since ABC was my main client, I unfortunately dropped the other one and said to my client contact at ABC, I said, "Look, you guys have been asking me for years to be an employee. I'm ready now. If you'll still have me, I'd love to become an employee." That's how it happened. And then I became an employee and worked for them for about 10 years as an employee. And then got to the same point I was in 2007. I felt like I was chafing against the kind of corporate strictures, wanted to do things on my own. But the main difference between leaving and starting my own job, my own company the second time or restarting it, was at that point, I had sort of fallen in love with data analytics and in particular R. And I know that you've heard me talk about R a lot.
I have.
And where that sort of came from was, I don't know if you remember this, but I think it was 2016 when we had our annual meeting in Las Vegas. And I was the annual meeting chair, and our keynote speakers were Chrissy Hofbeck and Jim Gusha. And we were talking about big data and data analytics. And Jim said something about the main tools for data analytics and using big data are either R or Python. And I said, okay, I'm going to learn one of those. And I just found R easier to get into. And once I got into it and started using it, I started to see all of these things that I thought that I could do for clients and for insurance companies because I felt insurance companies weren't using all the data that they had access to. And so I said, that's my value proposition is I'm going to take my underwriting and insurance knowledge, combine that with data analytics, and that's what I'm going to do. And of course, it didn't turn out anything like that, but that's what I had in mind when I left ABC and started my firm the second time.
Interesting. Like you said, yes, I've known that you're a big proponent of R. You've run some workshops as part of the CCA on R, but I never really understood the context of it until now. I think that's actually phenomenal, right? You go to an annual meeting, you pick up this one sound bite from the keynote, which were great keynotes, by the way. I was at that meeting, and having that spark a thought that leads you down a path. I think the thing that's most interesting about that, you're not the first person that I've talked to that's had that type of an experience, right? Where they're attending some sort of professional event, and a lot of them happen to be the CCA annual meeting, um, and they have there's something in there, a one-liner sometimes that sparks a thought that says, I need to go down that path. And
And
it takes them on a journey.
I completely agree with you. And one of the meetings I go to every year that is not strictly actuarial or related at all to the CCA is it's a meeting of the Vermont Captive Insurance
Hmm.
Association.
Yep.
And I did some work with captives very tangentially when I was really at ABC mostly. And I what I do is I go to sessions, and just like you said, if I come away from every session with one thought of something to explore, it will have been worth it. Because to me, that's how you don't just stay in the rut of doing the same thing all the time. You learn different things and then you explore, and who knows where it's going to lead to. Another example of that I had with that is one of our healthcare community webinars, I think it was, or it might have been the healthcare meeting. There was a whole talk about using price transparency data that's available now, that's required by CMS. And I went down a path with that because it merged my love of data with something new that I could try to work out with, and that led to all kinds of other things. So I agree with you completely, Michael. If one idea can spark going down a whole new path, and you never know where it's going to lead.
And what I love about that too is that a lot of times we may look at um, some of these meetings as continuing education focused, which they are, right? You can go, you can get credits, but if that's your sole focus, you're missing out on an element that could otherwise help improve you professionally uh, more significantly than just coming and getting credits.
I agree. And what I'm about to say is much easier for me because I don't fit into one of the molds. But I think if you go to the annual meeting and you only attend retirement sessions or you only attend healthcare sessions, I think you're missing out on
Hmm.
exactly what we're talking about is, and of course, I work in the cross discipline section, so I think those are always good things to go to. But I, I would advise anybody, if you have a specific practice area, branch out and go to a couple sessions from a couple of other areas. You never know what you're going to pick up.
Well, I think that's true too, even just going outside the actuarial profession, right? If there's other conferences or opportunities for something that you think is interesting, maybe on the periphery, dive in, see what it's all about.
100%. That's
Yeah,
exactly right.
yeah. Let's go back to you starting your own firm up here. So I think you've laid out the case for the compare and contrast of working for yourself versus working for a company.
Hmm.
What have been the biggest lessons learned from starting up your firm these couple of times?
Well, I would say probably the biggest lesson that I've learned is that you, when you start your own company, you're running a business. And if you're a sole proprietor like I am, even though it's technically an S corp, but basically I'm a sole proprietor, you do everything. You're the janitor, you're the head salesperson, you kind of do everything. You do payroll, you do accounting, you do all those things. And the thing that I have to constantly force myself to do, and I kind of alluded to this at our last, the annual meeting just last year during I think it was it was the opening session, is as I know a lot of people are surprised when I say this, but I consider myself an introvert, even though I know a lot of people hear me talk and I have no problem asking questions in meetings. But the classic introvert of like, recharging my batteries by being
Hmm.
alone,
Yep.
like to me that's really what the definition is. And but one of the things that I have to force myself to do is put myself out there in a sales type situation, yet I have to find ways to do it that make me comfortable. If I
Hmm.
feel like I'm doing it in too much of a sales pitch, I'm not going to do it well. It has to be, for me, it has to be very conversational. It has to be truly caring about what the other person says, going into a conversation to try to make it a conversation as opposed to let me try to sell you.
Hmm.
And that is something that, to me, is the biggest lesson that I have to sort of teach myself every day, is that I have to constantly be doing that. It's very easy to retreat into what I love doing best. And 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 that's great if that's what you want to do, but when you're in business for yourself, you're also the chief marketing officer, and you have to be doing that. If you're not, you're not doing that part of your job.
Oh, I like that. I think there's a lot of wisdom to pull out of that, right? It is hard, I would imagine too.
It is, especially if and one of the things I know that I struggle with, and I might have mentioned this when I was asking questions of Carrie at the meeting, was, this feeling of a lot of people have like imposter syndrome, and if you are out there putting yourself out there, you're afraid you're going to get asked a question that's going to expose that you really are an imposter. It's hard to get over that. So,
Hmm.
um, if you're thinking about going out on your own, I I would advise people who are thinking about that to think about all of that and all of what it means to be in business for yourself. That's not by way of wanting to dissuade anybody from doing that, because I'm very, very happy that I did it and I wouldn't change a thing, but that is definitely something that has been a challenge for me.
That's interesting. So, yeah, and I think that's important for people to realize, right? If you like just doing your one thing and you really don't want to deal with the other things that come along with owning your own business, because you do have to deal with them,
Right.
then maybe you want to rethink your plan. All right. So, looking back over your career, right? You've worked at big insurance company. You've been on your own for a couple of stints now. You've worked for another consulting firm. If you could go back, knowing what you know now, and give your entry level actuary self some advice, what would you say?
Well, that's a great question, and I will say that, you know unlike the answer I just gave you about, lessons learned and maybe wishing I had thought about things differently. Again, not that I would have changed anything I did, but I kind of just wishing I had approached some things a little differently. In terms of my entry level self, that is that period of time, let's say the first 5 years or 6 years of my career where I was taking exams and doing things. I'm actually very, very, as I look back on that, I'm very pleased at what I did. And I can't say that it was necessarily conscious or too strategic, but what I would say to either my entry level self or to somebody else is I would say maximize the number of varied types of experiences you can get, both professionally and personally. So, for example, I I mentioned that the MetLife actuarial development program was a rotational program.
Hmm.
I did 3 rotations while I was taking exams. Now I was fortunate I passed the exams fairly quickly, and then at that point, then you kind of move into sort of a permanent job. But in a way, I kind of wish that maybe even though the largest amount of time I spent in any one rotation was when I worked on GM, and part of that is because there was a geographic move involved there. But it would have been nice to have a fourth one in some other area,
Hmm.
and so I wish I had kind of maximized that opportunity a little more. But the one reason why I'm going to give myself a break on that was because I did take advantage of an opportunity to move from New York to Detroit. Now, back then, when I moved, most people would have said, in fact, Justin Hornburg himself said, "Oh my gosh, if it was only not Detroit, if it was Atlanta or Chicago or Minneapolis or any other place, but I said, okay, I'm going to go. And I fell in love with it, as soon as I got here and I met my wife here and now it's home and I wouldn't have done anything different. So I think the thing that I would advise anybody going into the profession as an entry level is take advantage of every opportunity you get to do something different, be it a different job, be it a different place to live. We hear a lot about diversity and diversification, and that to me, that embodies what that is. Diversity and diversification of knowledge, diversity and diversification of where you live. I think those are all things that help you grow as a person and as a professional.
I love that. I'm just jotting some notes down on that because, yeah, I love that. Maximize the variety of experiences, and I think that carries over. Like any, obviously, pose the question is like, tell us if this was your entry level self, what would you say? Uh, But there's no reason why somebody mid career or even late career can't take advantage of that, right? I think you and I have benefited from that greatly by some of our volunteer efforts with organizations like the CCA, where it gives us a platform to experiment, try different things. You've mentioned just the thoughts that you've had on, hey, I wonder if I could do this, and takes you down a path that helps you in your career, like all of those things. So I think it's good advice, not just for somebody coming into the profession, although there's a lot to be gained from that, but anybody along their career continuum.
Well, yes, and I would say that one area, and this may be a segue to something else you
Hmm.
might want to explore, is AI.
Yeah.
And I would say that I do see that a lot of mid-career people, I feel like they I sometimes sort of almost convince themselves that they can't do new things or that they don't want to do new things. And that's very unfortunate because I think we all can. So
Hmm.
yes, I completely agree with that. I think that advice, and I'm probably more on the later side of my career now. I'm 58 years old, so if you had an arc, I'm probably on this side in terms of time now.
Hmm.
Um, but yes, I agree with you. I think even mid-career people should constantly be trying to think of new things. And in fact, something that somebody said to me once, which came completely out of the blue, it wasn't one of a CCA person, but another actuary, someone I used to work with at MetLife, said he read something about how people should try to like reinvent themselves every 5 years.
Hmm.
Now, maybe that sounds a little dramatic, but the ethos of every few years I should stretch myself, I think is a good one to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is actually a good segue for what I wanted to talk a little bit about with you as well, and that is this concept of AI in the actuarial profession. So you're currently volunteering on the CCA's AI task force and have been coordinating sessions for the CCA on AI for the last couple of years. I'd love to get your thoughts on your views, your thoughts and views on AI in the actuarial profession. Like, where are there opportunities? What are the issues that need to be addressed? What are the ethical issues? Like, there's a lot of things that we can unpack here. So, where do you want to start?
Well, I guess the first place I'll start is what I just said, which is that I, and this is one of the things that I really try to do whenever I am coordinating a session or if I have an opportunity to actually speak in a session, is to encourage actuaries to actually use it. I think younger actuaries probably are much more um, confident and facile and may use it for things. But I think the mid-career and even older actuaries, I think should not be afraid of it or should not convince themselves that they either can't or shouldn't do it. And doing it could mean just openai.com and start asking questions. Start a conversation with ChatGPT and see where it leads. And so I think that for me, I think that there are enough voices out there in the profession that are putting up caution flags.
Mhm.
And I think the caution flags are absolutely warranted. You mentioned ethical concerns. I know in the insurance side of AI, there are some very valid concerns about using AI for underwriting, for insurance, or even on the mortgage side. There are concerns about using AI because if you've got data that has discriminatory practices built in, that's just going to result in discriminatory results coming out. We clearly should be concerned about those things. But I think I'm afraid a lot of people use those as reasons to say, well, I'm not even going to get into it because it's potentially bad. Yes, but it's also potentially really good. And unless you explore and play with it yourself, you won't see both sides of it. So I think if I was going to say one thing, if I was going to use one word for actuaries, I would say try.
Oh, I'd love that. I mean, I've had similar experiences there as well. Like and there's a lot of videos out there, be it on YouTube or other social media platforms, where you can find how people are using AI in even in some of the mundane tasks of work, right? And so yeah, I think there's a lot there, and I agree with you too. There's still some ethical issues to be waded through. There's probably, we haven't seen anything maybe explicitly in actuarial standards of practice yet, but that's not to say that that won't be something that has to be addressed for all the reasons that you articulated.
Well, and I think that you're right. I don't think it's explicitly been mentioned, but ASOP 56 does cover models.
Hmm.
And I think that, you know, one of the things that our good friend Ed Podlowski has mentioned to me many times is that a lot of people think that AI is ChatGPT, and there's a lot more to AI than just that. And one of the things that I'm really struggling with right now is how can the everyday actuary use AI beyond ChatGPT? What are the
Hmm.
additional things that we can do? And and the first thing that comes to mind is machine learning. Well, those are models. Predictive models are by definition models. And so I think ASOP 56 can inform about how we should think about using AI. And while I can't say I can cite chapter and verse on ASOP 56, I'm sure somewhere in there it says, even if you didn't develop the model, if you're using the model, you're still responsible for the results. Something
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
And I think that general ethos has to apply to ChatGPT and AI. Even if AI and artificial intelligence isn't explicitly mentioned in ASOP 56, I bet there's something in there like that that has to inform how we use it. In other words, you can't just take it and use it without thinking about it first.
Yeah, yeah, you stand to get in a lot of trouble that way if you do.
Exactly.
Um, but I think it's an interesting point though, right? Because things like ChatGPT or other Gen AI solutions that are out there can help you get started on something, right? But it doesn't absolve you of the need to fact check it, right? The one term that I find funny that's I think become common with Gen AI tools is this idea of hallucinating, where it just starts making stuff up, and it's not right. But so if you take it at face value without questioning it, you can find yourself producing things that are actually factually incorrect.
That's correct. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
So how do you actually use AI in your day-to-day work?
Well, that's a great question. So I mentioned that, at this point, I'm sort of at the point where I'm trying to think of how I can use AI beyond ChatGPT or other
Mhm.
LLMs. But the way there's probably three main things that I do with ChatGPT right now. One is a very common use, not just amongst actuaries, but anybody who deals with data. And I do a lot of programming in R, I do some Python work. And so I'll use ChatGPT to help me either debug code or, hey, can you help me write a function that does the following? And ChatGPT is just brilliant at coding. It's just fantastic at writing code in both R and Python. Another way I use it, and this is not just as an actuary or professionally, but also just personally, is I use it for research. If there's a topic that I see either on LinkedIn or just hear about in the news that I'm interested in, I will ask it to give me some background on that topic. And then maybe I'll go off and read something specific on a website, gain some more information, feed the website back into ChatGPT and ask it to elaborate on a particular paragraph. I find it to be very, very good for that. Now, again, that's something that, as not an expert, I can't necessarily verify every single thing it says, but periodically, especially if I read something that just strikes me as being a little bit unusual, then I'll go do some of my own separate research on that item. So I would say programming assistance, research, and then the third area, and this is one I'm as a little plug, I'm planning on demonstrating in one of our healthcare community calls coming up, is something that I'm calling kind of project partnership, and I've been doing this specifically with respect to. I mentioned price transparency data before. That was one of the things that I got kind of sparked to look at. The beautiful thing about price transparency data is that it's all public, so you can download it, but it's very, very opaque in terms of getting into it and really understanding what's inside of it.
Mhm.
Well, I download a file and I go to ChatGPT and I say, okay, I just downloaded Anthem's price transparency files. How do I get into them? Like, how do I crack the code to really get into what's really in there? And then ChatGPT will say, okay, well, tell me the name of your file and what do let's run this program on it to see what the structure of the file is. Now let's dive into this sub element of it. And I go back and forth with it. Okay, well, now I did this. Now what's next? Or I'd like to zero in on what Anthem pays this hospital. How do I
Mhm.
find that out? And then it guides me through that. And so that's what I call kind of project partnership. Whereas if, let's say I was with a human that really understood this, I'd be asking them those questions.
Mhm.
But I don't
Mhm.
have a human with me. So I asked ChatGPT. And so that I found to be extremely beneficial. So I would say those three areas. I would say research, programming help, and project partnership are probably the main ways I use it now.
Oh, I love that. I think those are all really good areas. And I think you're right. This is one of the things that I've been after for a little bit, right? We've had a lot of training sessions on AI and large language models and machine learning, and you kind of get the idea for what they are. But what I've been really hungering for is the practical application. And I think what you're articulating here is that. And I've had my own experiences on those fronts as well. There was a book I bought from Harvard Business Review not too long ago that I put out there on LinkedIn because I enjoyed it so much that gave you a lot of the prompts to say, hey, look, these are the different things you can do with it. Now try it. Like, and here's the prompt script to go through to help you realize that, oh, you can have that back and forth with it. And sometimes too, I've had the experience too of calling out ChatGPT saying, actually, what you said was wrong, and here's why. Try again.
Right.
And it'll come back and say, oh yeah, you're right. I was making stuff up, and and here's actually what it is. And
Well, one of the things I did, and I put this out in the, I think I put this out in the all members community for the CCA was, um, I asked ChatGPT to calculate the payment of an annuity under certain conditions,
Mhm.
and I knew what the right answer was, but it got it wrong. And so I kind of then coached it to get the right answer. And then I said, now, okay, let's extend that to a life annuity. It's no longer an annuity certain. So now I need to tell you what mortality table to use. And I said, are you familiar with this particular mortality table? And it said, oh, yes, I am. And I said, okay, so now use that, give me the life annuity value. Did all this, got the wrong answer. And I said, well, let's start with this way for debugging it. What do you have as the mortality rates for that table? And it said, well, I don't really have the table, but I kind of approximated it based on the era of, and I'm like, no, you
No.
can't do that. And then once I gave it the table, Michael, it did it right.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop to say, I don't know that table exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where you really need to bring what people call the domain expertise into it, or the
Hmm.
kind of the human in the loop sort of aspect of AI. But once I felt like I trained it, it seemed to know what it was doing. And then I asked it like 5 follow-on questions and it got all those right. So, and that was a lot of fun, to be perfectly honest with you. It was fun to go through that process.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and can be used for so many things, professionally, personally. I mean, we used it to help plan out a vacation that we're taking out of country
Yep.
at the end of the year, just to say, hey, and my wife was very detailed in the parameters that it gave it, and it came back and said, here's a day by day itinerary of the things that you're going to do, where you're going to go, how you're going to do it. It was great.
Yes, it's
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah. Well, Justin, this has been great so far, and I want to pivot for the last little bit of our discussion today to talk about leadership. This is our
Sure.
leadership development podcast, after all. In thinking about people that you consider to be successful leaders, what traits do they have? How do they demonstrate their leadership?
Well, you know, when I was at MetLife, I went to a lot of leadership courses, and some of them were better than others, but there was one in particular that I remember is called Creating the Future. And there was one thing that I took away from that I've never, how can I say this? I've thought about this as kind of a rubric for evaluating leaders, and it's never been wrong as far as I can tell. And this rubric is: great leaders are respectful of the past, realistic about the present, and optimistic about the future. And to me, I feel like that really encapsulates what makes someone a good leader and someone that someone would want to follow. And I think if we think about people who are good leaders, people who we may think are not quite so good leaders, we can maybe think about areas in which maybe they go against those kind of 3 principles,
Mhm.
you know? And so I think that the people who I think about as being good leaders, I think encompass those. And maybe this is a little bit trite, because I'm a big sports fan and I live in Detroit, so now I root for the Detroit Lions. But the Lions were really bad for a long time, and in the last few years, they've picked up a couple of new leaders. One is the general manager, a guy named Brad Holmes, and the other is the coach, Dan Campbell. And when you look at some of the things that Dan Campbell has talked about, like for example, I was thinking about this. When he, they were pretty poor his first 2 years when he was the coach.
Mhm.
But he's talked very emotionally about the guys that were on those teams. And what he said was, yeah, we didn't win. And yeah, those guys aren't here anymore. But those guys gave everything to this team. They helped build the foundation that we have now. And he even said, he goes, look, he goes, I saw myself in a lot of those guys. He goes, I didn't have any talent. Yeah, I played in the league, but it was all on grit and hard work. Well, that's him being respectful of the past. He didn't say, oh, yeah, we stunk. He was like, yeah, we didn't win, but those guys did everything they could to do their best. He's realistic about the present and he's always optimistic about the future. So, and maybe it's easy for me to think about sports because I'm so into it, but when I think about right now, I think about leaders. Those are and maybe it's Dan Campbell in particular to think about because I really think he embodies that how you think about the past, present, and the future. And another thing I think is that if you're going to be a good leader, people are going to have to want to follow you. And I think those three things, how you feel about the past, present, and the future, and being transparent and being honest and being courageous, those are the things that are going to inspire people to follow you. So I think those are the things I think about when I think about leadership right now.
Oh, I love that. And as you're explaining that and talking through that, I can think of examples as well in each of those three categories of the past, present, and future of people that I know um, don't necessarily meet one of those and how it really does derail their effectiveness as a leader, right? The one that came to mind, with getting specific, but the present, right? Not being realistic about the present, right? Somebody that's overly optimistic or likes to ignore the reality of the situation and try to paint a flowery picture because they're trying to paint that optimistic future, but they're translating it into the current and how everybody just sees right through it. And they're like, no, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Or as you say, if they just completely ignore, looming problems,
Hmm.
like for example, I would say that, you know, to be realist, like as an actuary, for example, let's say, to be realistic about the present right now is to not, one thing in my mind is not to ignore the fact that the Social Security Trust Fund is going to run out in some period of time.
Hmm.
Now that doesn't mean that we have to act right this second, but it feels like we should be talking about it maybe more than we are, and so not confronting those problems. I mentioned courage is another thing that I think leaders have. I think I think, so yes, I think you're right. Not being realistic about the present, either overly optimistic or just ignoring issues that we have, I think is a failure of
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah, no, and I love the example you gave too with the Detroit Lions. I mean, that's definitely it's clear a turnaround story from where they
Exactly.
used to be. So it's spot on. So when you think about other role models that come to mind when you think about leadership and the people that you've tried to emulate, anybody else come to mind besides the guys over at the Detroit Lions?
Well, I'll give you two. One is, this goes back a little a ways and probably from my Gen X past, is Ronald Reagan. I think Ronald Reagan was a very effective leader. I don't, I don't mean necessarily from a political perspective. Of course, he was our president, so he was a politician by definition. But, I think about Ronald Reagan's optimism. He was always, people talk about his sunny disposition and sunny optimism. And he was also people called him the great communicator. He was also a very, very effective communicator. So I would say in that respect, I think of him as being a good leader. And I would say also there's one gentleman who was the one who actually encouraged me to move out to Detroit the very first time. And um, at that time, um, I would say that like my performance evaluations that I had in my job, I'd only been with MetLife for a couple years, had been kind of neutral. Okay, you're doing fine, but
Hmm.
nothing like, special or anything. And then when this person said, "Oh, I'd love to have you move out to Detroit," even though I was still a student, even though I was still an actuarial student, I was like, I felt like I'd run through a brick wall for this guy. Like I felt like it was the first time that somebody said to me, "You're good, and you're so good that we want to pay you to pick up and move and help us start this unit in a different place."
Hmm.
And and to me, that was so inspiring that I was willing to do anything for this guy. And so and I know maybe this is all selfish because it has to do with me personally, but the idea, like I really got the sense that he knew and understood and cared about me as a person. And I
Hmm.
think that's another thing about good leaders is they genuinely care about the people that they're leading. Now, that doesn't always mean that they give them everything that they want,
Hmm.
but they understand what motivates those people, what drives them, and then they try their best to kind of manage what they're trying to get done from a business or organizational perspective with what those people want to try to accomplish for themselves. And I think that's where really good leadership can happen. And so when I think about the gentleman who encouraged me to move out here the first time, I felt like he was talking to me as a person, as Justin Hornburg, and it was
Hmm.
incredibly inspiring. And so, um, yeah, I would say those two people.
So turning to the future then, what do you see as the imperatives for future successful leaders within our profession, within the actuarial profession?
Well, I would go back to the kind of the rubric that I mentioned. You know, I think
Hmm.
that the being respectful of the past. Our profession has such a great past and is built on a a real bedrock of science and mathematics, finance, interest theory, all of the stuff that we studied in the first the associateship exams and things like that. Being realistic about the present, I mentioned Social Security. Medicare has some issues. I think right now we've got issues going on with the perception of healthcare and healthcare delivery and healthcare financing in our country. Unfortunately, we had that assassination of the guy who was the head of UHC. Now, he wasn't an actuary, but there's a lot of actuaries that work at UHC, and there's a lot of actuaries that work in the insurance business. And I feel like to some degree we're being a bit torn apart by that. And I don't mean the profession necessarily, I mean as our culture. And I think actuaries have a role to play in the discourse around these issues. And then I think the optimism about the future is we can solve these problems, and I think if we can, this is just my personal feeling, if we can get beyond the infighting and the black and white thinking about everything and the villainization of people who think differently than we do about a particular issue, I'm convinced we can solve these problems. And I'd like to see the leadership in the profession help us move towards the future of dealing with these issues, meaning Social Security, Medicare, healthcare, other things where I feel like we have a unique contribution to bring. So I think
Hmm.
if we keep that rubric in mind about being realistic, respectful of the past, realistic of the present, and optimistic about the future, I think that's a good rubric for all leaders, and I think it can apply directly to our profession.
Wow. This has been great, Justin. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today. I mean, some of the things that I'm taking away from our discussion is that idea of maximizing the variety of experiences that you have. I love how you put it as it's kind of a new spin on diversity,
Yes,
right? It's that diversity of thought, but maybe more self-contained. I love that. I love your thoughts on AI and the ways to use it, programming, research, project partnership. And then I really love your thoughts on leadership that you've shared with us today. And that rubric that you outlined is definitely going to stay with me. Somebody that can be respectful of the past, realistic about the present, and optimistic about the future, and genuinely caring about people. That's a recipe for success for
I
sure,
think so. I think so.
within our profession and outside of it as well. So, well, Justin, I definitely want to thank you today for joining us. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, all my contact information is available on the CCA website. My email is justin.hornburg @groupinsuranceactuarial.com, all one word, Group Insurance Actuarial. But you can contact me through the CCA website. And again, all my contact information is there, including my phone number. So I'd love to talk to anybody about anything. I really enjoyed this conversation, Michael. And I've had conversations like this with other actuaries. I love doing it. So anybody, please reach out. And thank you very much, Michael, for the opportunity.
Yeah, people can obviously catch you at the CCA's annual meeting where you're on the
Exactly.
committee and putting together some great sessions for this year's meeting as well. So I want to encourage everyone to subscribe and like this podcast to help us share stories like Justin's that can benefit the actuarial community. As a reminder, the leadership development community of the CCA is open to any actuary. You can reach out to the CCA to join. Special thanks to Shannon Peterson of CCA staff for helping produce today's event. Join us for upcoming CCA events and follow us online on social media and on our website. With that, thanks again, Justin. Thanks
Thank
everyone for
you.
tuning in.
Yes, thank you.